This is the basics of stained glass, part one. So the basics of stained glass, you need to understand that you are taking pieces of stained glass and you are cutting them out into essentially puzzle pieces that you will be putting together by putting a copper foil around the edges and then applying a solder around those edges to hold it together. You can do this on the outside as well, or you can use a lead came, which comes in either an I bracket, which looks like this, and the stained glass would be placed in here on either side, or a U bracket, which would go on the outside, and then the stained glass would go inside the U bracket. So using the lead came will give you a somewhat straight edge. You can see that depending on how the glass is cut, the lead will form around the edges. So if it's not straight, it'll be kind of wavy or bent a bit. If you want to do more organic edges, like you can use lead came, or you can just apply straight solder. So to begin with, you need to draw up a design. And for people that are just learning how to do stained glass, I highly recommend doing geometric shapes and not too intricate. So you're going to need to have two copies of the plan that you are going to make. So what I typically do is I have take a regular size sheet of paper, fold that in half. Then I have them open it back up and draw the design that they want. A couple of tips before you begin designing your glass piece. The first idea is that if you are trying to do a piece where a corner goes into another piece, so here's a square and here's a big triangle. This piece is going into this triangle piece. If you're trying to do a piece like that, this is very difficult unless you have a glass saw or a grinder. What I recommend is if you do want a corner to go into another piece like this, you divide the larger or the piece that the corner is going into. Because when you are cutting glass likes to break in a straight line. So if you're trying to cut this angle out of this piece like this, more than likely if you're etching in here and going to break it, that break line is going to continue going this way. Or likewise, if you're trying to go this way, it's going to continue breaking this way. So instead of putting yourself through all that trouble, I would recommend, if you are trying to do a corner into another piece like this one, divide the piece into sections like this so it's wrapping around the corner instead of trying to take a chunk out of the corner. And this will be covered more when we get into the actual glass cutting. The second thing is, like I mentioned before, you are soldering and you are putting on copper foiling around the pieces to hold them together. So if the pieces start getting really narrow or thin, when you go to put the copper on and start doing the soldering, you're actually going to be covering up a good portion, probably a 1/4 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch of each piece of glass. So to have a little bit wider or a little bit longer piece will allow the glass to show more instead of being covered up mostly by the solder. Another tip is to try and stay away from circles. Because circles have an edge that is curved and it continues to curve, it is very difficult unless you have, again, a grinder or a glass saw to get those curves completely around. because if you try to make a straight break, it can curve around to a certain extent, but at some point the curve is not going to break in the direction that you want. You can try to break it multiple times, where you break it going around this edge, this edge, this edge, and then this edge, so that it goes all the way around. But ultimately, as beginners, I would suggest staying away from circles. For this video, I'm going to use a very simple geometric shape. Once you have your design laid out, you want to number those. So this is number 1, number 2. You have all your shapes drawn out and numbered. You're going to fold over the piece of paper, and again, you can do this with larger pieces, but for our immediate purposes, I'm staying to this half sheet size. And then you're going to just trace over the lines that you've already established. And make sure that you number the copy exactly like you would number the original piece. So this is the original, this is the copy. The next step is you're going to color in these areas in the colors that you would like to make it. So once I am finished, don't need to color both of these. But once I have these colored and set up and I've made the copy of my pages, I'm going to take a scissors and I'm going to cut them apart. So one is going to be my map, the one that I'm going to leave intact, and the other I'm going to use to figure out the different shapes that I need to cut out of glass. So I'm going to take this sheet and I'm going to cut it into pieces. So now I have 2 matching copies of all the pieces. So when I place this on top of the glass and I cut the glass out, I can also reassemble them. And so when I am doing much more elaborate or much more detailed pieces, I can remember where those pieces go, and if I would lose a piece that I need, I also have a map that says, oh, I'm missing this piece, and you can reproduce that piece by putting it over and copying it again. So this is part 1 of stained glass. In the next session, we will be going through how to cut and break glass and start sizing it for the piece.
Do more, do better.